Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am bringing you my 5-star reads of 2020. 2020 was a bit of a wild ride in terms of 5-star reads. You may remember that in 2019 I only had 5-star reads, I think, that entire year, and I started off 2020 like ready to blow that out of the water. Right at the beginning of the year, I had a number of 5-star reads, and I thought, wow, if this keeps up all 2020, I'm going to have so many 5-star reads by the end of the year, I won't be able to fit them all in one video, and then things went south pretty quick. So I have, depending on how you want to count, either 7 or 8 books on this list. That is more than last year, but they were all books I read from January through May of 2020. Those first 5 months after May, there was no more joy. Also, because 2020 was the year where no wrap-ups happened on this channel, or at least very, very few wrap-ups, I've only actually technically wrapped up 2 of the books on this list. I have talked about some of them at great length in other videos, some of them I haven't mentioned at all. But this is not a wrap-up. I am just going to tell you a little bit of what specifically spoke to me in each of these books and why they were favorites for me. These books are presented in the order in which I read them. That's how I do these end-of-year favorites lists. And I think it's particularly fitting for 2020 because there is this stark shift that happens end of March, beginning of April, where the only things I loved were things that just sucked me in and away entirely. And then there is that point where I stopped having 5-star reads at all after May. The first book on this list is the only one I don't have a physical copy of. It came from the library, and this is going to be a bit of a doozy to talk about in isolation because this is volume 2 of something where I don't think I have even mentioned that I have read volume 1. I haven't mentioned this series on this channel at all. This is Strong Female Protagonist Book 2, which is a print edition of a webcomic by Brennan Mulligan with art by Molly Ostertag. Volume 1 was a 4-star read for me, and then Volume 2 stepped it up a notch. Both in terms of the art style, because this is a webcomic, this is a thing where the art style changes and develops significantly over time. Book 2 marks a shift, a dramatic shift from black and white to color, and I did really like the color look, but it also digs deeper into some heavier themes and ideas. It's incredibly introspective. It is a superhero thing. The main character, Allison, is a girl who was recruited to become a teenage superhero when she was quite young, and now she's revealed her identity and left superheroing, and she's gone to college to try and figure out better ways to fix what's wrong with the world than just hitting stuff, because that's what she's been good at up until now because her superpower is super strength. I mentioned that this volume delves into some heavy subject matter. It deals a lot with sexual assault and what sort of actions may be justified in cases where the criminal justice system fails the victims. There are only 2 print volumes of this right now, but there is a little more of the webcomic online beyond where this volume ends. I also read that portion of it and would rate it highly if it was a book. That said, this webcomic is unfinished and has been on sort of indefinite hiatus for a very long time because I think the creators have both gotten very busy with other projects. But despite its unfinished status, I would really recommend this webcomic. Next, I want to talk about Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, which is a very short YA novel. This is one of those books where my enjoyment of it at the time I read it was bolstered a bit by the fact that I could sort of draw some interesting connections between the themes of this book and the themes of some other media I was consuming at the time, and that's always very exciting for me when that happens, when the stories I'm reading and watching sort of feel like they're in conversation with each other. But even on its own, this is absolutely an excellent 5-star book for me. It is so tightly constructed. It's such a precise story in delivering its plot and its themes. This presents a sort of utopian society in which a lot of the very basic, everyday, mundane evils in our world that we sort of accept and take for granted have been fixed. And although it hints a bit at the cost that was paid by a previous generation to get there, it really focuses on what do you do to maintain a virtuous society that takes care of its people. How do you prevent monsters from returning, especially if you don't want to talk about them? This has a cast of Black characters and a trans girl protagonist. Her name is Jan, and she teams up with something that looks like a monster that has magically emerged from one of her mother's paintings to track down something truly monstrous happening within her community under all of their noses. Next on my list is A Choir of Lies by Alexandra Rowland, which is the companion sequel to A Conspiracy of Truths. And I liked A Conspiracy of Truths, but this feels like a more heartfelt, personal book to me, perhaps because I personally related to it so very strongly. And so the reasons this was a 5-star read for me are quite personal. This follows Ilfing, who was a supporting character in the first book, sometime later. And he, like his mentor, who was the protagonist of the first book, is a chant, which is a sort of wandering storyteller with a religious function as well. And he's doing very badly in this book. He's not doing well. We find him in this situation that I think is really relatable to a lot of people with creative, artistic callings, where he feels like he can't do the thing that has been his purpose in life anymore. He's dealing with the aftermath of this past mentorship relationship that was very messed up, but he also deals with a lot of things on his own very badly. And so I was reading this with some amount of trepidation because I kept feeling like this story could have really stung or been painful to get through, but it wasn't for me because I think Alexandra Rowland tells this story so compassionately. There's a lot that's bittersweet in this book, things that made me, want better things to happen, different outcomes, but in the end it felt right to me. And someday, if I ever actually do an actual wrap-up that includes this book, I will talk about the actual plot and some of the other big themes, but that character story was the reason this was a 5-star read for me. Next is a book I just wrapped up in my very last video on this channel. This is the book of Atrix Wolf by Patricia A. McKillip, which I've said every time I've mentioned it, I think would be a great place to start with McKillip's writing if you're unsure. It's always hard to describe a McKillip book succinctly because she does write such heightened, mysterious fantasy. But this actually has a fairly self-contained, relatively straightforward fairy tale-ish plot about a prince and a magical girl working in the palace kitchens, and some magical events from 20 years prior that caused some things that need to be put to rights. Ultimately, though, I think what made this a 5-star read above some other McKillip books that have been 4-star reads for me was just the sort of pure, simple pleasure of watching the characters slowly put together the pieces of this magical puzzle. And then the rest of these books are the books that I read once quarantine hit and I was needing things that were very escapist. I needed something that was just going to be an extremely immersive experience, and the book that I read that just hit that note perfectly for me was The Starless C by Erin Morgenstern. This was very much my quarantine mood book in the first half of April when I read this. It was slow, but something I just looked forward to sinking myself into for chunks of time because I knew it was going to take me away completely. This has such a sprawling sense of all of these different threads of very mythic feeling story, as well as what I thought was a very likable and engaging storyline with the main cast of characters. It's a book to sort of wander into and get lost in, and that's what I loved about it. This is the other book on this list that I have wrapped up. I believe I wrapped this up in a video where I talked about the 3 books that were nominated in the fantasy category for the BookTube SFF Awards. And then the rest of the books that I gave 5 stars to were like fast-paced science fiction with really, really strong, likable characters. The first was Catfishing on CatNet by Naomi Kritzer, which I pulled an all-nighter to read all in one night, which was a little bit wild for me because that hadn't happened to me in a very long time. This is a young adult, near-future sci-fi novel that I think I described on Goodreads as feeling like it sits right at the crossroads of Murderbot and Eliza and Her Monsters, which was a contemporary YA that I think a lot of sort of genre readers really liked. It's got this inclusive found family friend group thing with an extremely likable AI character trying to take care of this friend group. It deals a lot with the nuances of online friendships and communities. And then it's also got this very fast-paced sort of thriller plotline with increasingly high stakes. I think if you were unfamiliar with the short story this was inspired by, or hadn't heard much about it, the sort of marketing of the cover and the tagline might be a little deceptive. This looks like very much a thing about the scary horrors of technology in our lives, but what's really scary in this book is abusive people, specifically one person. And the same technology that can let someone very scary track you down can also connect you to the people who can be your support network. And then I did mention Murderbot as a comparison point for Catfishing on CatNet, and the last 5-star books that brought me joy in 2020 were Murderbot. I did a reread of the novella series leading up to the arrival of my pre-ordered copy of Network Effect, the novel. And this is where I said it depends on how you count, whether this is 7 or 8 5-star reads, because I decided I wasn't going to change any of my ratings of the novellas on a reread. And of the 4 novellas, the one that I originally gave 5 stars was Exit Strategy, the 4th one. And I think I stand by my 5 stars for this one, but I also felt like reading them back to back, because I read them one a day, I think, for 4 days, was that Artificial Condition, the second one, really stood out for me in that reread in a way that it didn't when I read it on its own. So if I had been changing my ratings, which I wasn't, I might have actually bumped Artificial Condition up to 5 as well. But if I'm only counting books that were new to me this year, or like that I've read for the first time even since joining BookTube, then Network Effect would be the only one of this series that would count towards the total, because I did give this 5 stars. As the 5th book in the series, there's relatively little I feel I can say about this on its own, but one thing I will say is that if you're like me and the one plot thread from the 4 novellas you thought really needed to be developed further was the one about art and why a research university would have a ship like art, this is the Murderbot book you have been waiting for. This does put more front and center some of the socio-political and economic things that are sort of the constant backdrop of the 4 novellas. It does move the series forward in some interesting ways, but it is still like pure Murderbot. You get the essence of that character throughout, which is, I think, exactly what fans want. And that was it. Those were my 5-star reads of 2020. Let me know how 2020 was for you in terms of 5-star reads. Was there a dramatic shift somewhere around the spring? There sure was for me. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.